Hey, good morning, everybody. Whoa, look at this hair going on. Whoa. Oh, just ignore that. All right. Anyway, lesson three review here. The questions which are due in just a few minutes. Number one, what Union General came up with the Anaconda Plan? That would be General Winfield Scott, right? The alternative name for the Anaconda Plan is called Scott's Great Snake. Number two, what April 62 battle? That would be the Battle of Shiloh. And speaking of General Grant, the person who came to his defense was Abraham Lincoln. So, in spite of the heavy casualties that were often suffered under General Grant, he was somebody who was willing to engage the enemy and fight. And that's really what Abraham Lincoln needed. Now, on to the next section. Lesson four, like there's a section in your textbook that will appear on the next slide that says those who fought, and I think it's a pretty apt title because whenever I teach about the Civil War, I'm always so impressed by the numbers, and I don't mean impressed like I'm clapping along, but it's just almost like, wow, the scope of the Civil War is so much larger than the American Revolution or the War of 1812. For instance, at the Battle of Shiloh, where you had 23,000 American casualties in total. Um, that is roughly the same number of casualties that existed during the entire American Revolution. So all from 1775 to the treaty was signed in 1783. Anyway, 6, 7, 8 years of the American Revolution, the same number of casualties died during those years than during those 2 days of Shiloh. However, when you talk about numbers, sort of like you don't really view those as people, right? It's like, well, 10,000 here, 90,000 here, 50,000 here, but you forget that these were human beings. These were fathers, these were sons, these were brothers in some cases. These were daughters and mothers. So anyway, this little section from the book talks about those who fought, about their different backgrounds, what jobs they had, how old they would be, things like that. The next section, I took a few paragraphs and just sort of boiled it down to some notes here, what their daily routine would be like, what they ate. Note that when it talks about sort of their meals, the Union, the North, definitely had better provisions than the South. Hunger was a real issue for Southern soldiers, especially towards the latter half of the war. But for both sides, the further the war continued, the less robust their meals became. And in the South, like their soldiers did not really have coffee. They would try to have these coffee substitutes. There's also some interesting reading about what sort of alcohol they tried to make, which I'll try to find some of the recipes for that, but they're pretty gross. The it was really a lot of boredom in their daily life, interspersed with abject terror whenever they had to go into battle, and then hygiene, of course, was an issue during at camp life. But one way I thought to maybe impress upon you the what it was like for soldiers and people on the home front was to look at some letters, look at some journals, some primary sources. So this is probably the most famous Civil War letter that we have. It's called the Bixby Letter, and there's a little bit of lack of clarity as if Abraham Lincoln actually wrote it. But you can see here that it's written to a Mrs. Bixby in Boston, Massachusetts, and 5 of her sons died in battle fighting for the Union. And so this letter is sent, as you can see, in late 1864. This letter was sort of made much more famous because in the 1997 movie Saving Private Ryan, it is used as one of the reasons why in the movie Saving Private Ryan, they decide to go find and save Private Ryan. So if you click on this clip, it's a little bit confusing because it's a movie from 1997 that is the subject matter of that movie is 1944. And then in that letter in 1944, they're reading they're reading the letter from 1864. So if you click on the video and you're like, these people aren't dressed like they're in the 1800s, right? They're supposed to be dressed like they're in the 1940s. But it is a powerful reading of the letter. The other one I have here is a journal from B.Y. Malone. Now, the spelling and the punctuation and the capitalization, these are all his from Bartlett Yancey Malone. He was a Confederate prisoner of war in Maryland. And so I decided to keep those in just to show sort of the varying levels of education, because when you read the next letter by a guy named Sullivan Ballou, their level of writing skills are totally different. But I think that's okay. That's to acknowledge that, hey, some people have probably had a formal education and gone to college who are soldiers, and some probably have very little education at all. But it also is interesting to see sort of what was important to him. You know, he didn't write much each day, but what were those things that he chose to write about for B.Y. Malone? And the last one. So for this one, there's a link to it. For this one, there is no link. But this next one, it's a little bit longer. It's actually 2 pages. Sullivan continued, written by Sullivan Ballou. And this one is actually read on that documentary that I've been playing you clips of. And it's just, it's an incredible piece of writing. And the idea that the audience of this is just this one woman. So it's Sullivan is the husband. Sarah is the wife. He is a soldier from Rhode Island. And just some of the language in it is truly remarkable. He talks about how much he loves his wife, and he fawns over her. That's clearly obvious, but he, in a way, almost apologizes that he still feels the need to do this, even if fighting takes him away from her in terms of death on the battlefield, that this is something that he needs to do. He also goes back right here and talks about the American Revolution, which I thought was interesting because Abraham Lincoln mentioned the American Revolution in his first inaugural address. About that was a time when the country came together and we started this grand American experiment. And Sullivan is using that same sort of rationale. And on to the second page, he talks about how how much he looks forward to growing up and growing old with her and seeing their boys grow up as into honorable men, but how that might not happen because of the battle. And then he talks in this last paragraph, he basically talks about becoming a ghost, but that if he dies, then he will still be with her. And the reading of that is like I said, is on this link, and it'll be from the documentary that we've been watching. And then just a couple short questions for you about that. So that is it for the day. So just a little bit of an understanding about what these soldiers had to go through on a very personal level instead of viewing them as. All right. Hopefully you have a wonderful day. It looks sunny outside, and I'm going to go put my contacts in and start my day. Bye.